St Giles Files.
Hello and welcome to this new episode of the St Giles Files. We are Ciara and Stephen, and today we're going to be talking about the bells and the clocks of St Giles, which have a much longer and more intricate history than I ever thought possible. So I'm going to start off talking about the bells, and then Stephen is going to take over, talk about the clock for a bit, and we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end. I thought that it would be a really straightforward task to create a timeline. Bish bash bosh, long lunch, but that is absolutely not what happened. The bells, the history of the bells have, this is about to be a very convoluted analogy, but have woven a very tangled web, and I am not the spider in the middle, I am the fly on the outside. But I'm hoping that with Stephen's help, we can try and work out a bit of a timeline for them. But I'm going to start in 1460 because that's the first time we have some really kind of serious records about the bells. And in fact, I'm going to talk first about the Great Bell, which is a bell that we're going to come back to. It was brought over from Flanders, so it's not actually Scottish. Again, maybe talking about Scottish craftsmanship is something that we'll pick up later. My favourite thing about this bell is that it has an inscription on it, and it says, "I mourn the dead, I call the living, I disperse the thunder." Or potentially, according to which record you read, it might say, "I break the force of lightning," which I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty hardcore thing to have on a bell.
I didn't even know you could break lightning.
I don't even know if you can. I think it comes from this old medieval tradition that the sound of a church bell could actually disperse thunder and could disperse storms. I don't know the specifics of it, but that's something I've come across, so it might be in reference to that.
Yeah. Okay.
But we're going to fast forward a bit and talk about St Giles as a collegiate. So at that point, there was someone called a sacristan. Hopefully, I've pronounced that right. He was in charge of the Great Bell, which we already talked about, a curfew bell and a funeral bell. Now, one of these bells was called the Mary Bell. In 1560, perhaps because of its name, so this is kind of post-Reformation, the Mary Bell, which also confusingly is referred to as the Pardon, Vesper, or Ava. Yeah, I know it's a lot to just stick with me. There's a lot. Yeah. So one of these bells, the Mary bells, was removed because it was considered that only 3 bells were necessary at this time. This is sort of classic Reformation paring down of
no music, no fun.
No music, no fun, no bells. The thunder can disperse itself. And we have mention in the Berg, we found it through the Berg Record Society. It's an entry from May 1560, which shows the council only believed 3 bells are necessary. And both Rosalind K. Marshall and our old friend William Chambers believes that St Giles still has the Mary Bell. So it's the little bell, the one we have in the nave, and it says in Latin, "O Mother of God, remember me," which suggests it's the Mary Bell.
I've come across that bell being one of our oldest as well, in a different way. But anyway, you carry on and then we can, I suppose, come back.
Are you planting a flag by any chance?
No, not anything quite as aggressive as planting a flag. I
will say that in this podcast, in the spirit of reconciliation, Stephen and I are not actually presenting opposing sides. We're just presenting our research. So the usual conflict that fuels the podcast is not present this time. It's just the sheer love of history.
I think if we could have possibly found any way of having an argument, we would have done. But I think bells and clocks is not where it's at.
It's hard. I really tried to find it in my heart to have a really strong opinion either way about bells, but I just couldn't do it. So I hope everyone is okay with that. But I'll move on to 16. So I'm going to talk about 1609. The common bell, which I already mentioned, was found to be cracked, but it was only in 1620 that it was taken away to be sold, and a new bell was bought. They were raised just in time to mark the marriage of James IV's son. In 1681, a man called Thomas Moody left 20,000 merks. Scott, you're the economics man, so yeah, sounds about right. But the town council decided to divert the funds to get musical bells. I think are quite kind of famous within the Edinburgh historical canon of the time. Walter Scott was not a fan of them. In one of his poems it said, "And from his steeple jingling loud, St Giles mingling din." I'm not sure if din has changed over the years, but to me that sounds like he was pretty against them.
No, I actually would like to plant a flag here because I did a little bit of stuff about St Giles bells, and there was 2 or 3 different sets of bells, which I'm sure you're going to get onto. But I'd like to just put them out there as not jingling din or mingling din, as he says.
Okay, fair enough. So it's Stephen Preston versus Walter Scott, because I
Yeah,
come back to that one in a bit.
yeah,
Yeah, so I suppose the 17th century musical bells are quite interesting. I found more on them perhaps than anything else, partly because St Giles actually had the earliest musical carolling in Britain. So it was cast in 1699, and it was 23 musical bronze bells, and they would actually play popular tunes every Sunday. So there's a local music master who would come in and play them. And there's a quote from a 1980 Scotsman article, which is a really great phrase in it, which I'm going to read, which says, "Entertaining the populace below in broad-minded, non-Calvinistic manner with pop tunes of the day," which I think is great.
yeah.
And
I remember
yeah,
having read that previously, and I just love the idea of pop tunes. Like, yeah, pop, get down with it. Ooh,
yeah, everyone's just on the Royal Mile, like, oh, I love this one.
yeah, play it again.
Yeah, exactly. I hope it was sort of like an early precursor to the radio, and people could write the song that they wanted, and they put it on a carrier pigeon and they take it up to
Yeah.
the man playing the bells.
I also like the idea, though, that surely it wasn't written for bells. It was written for piano or organ.
Yeah.
So this music that's supposed to be playing on the piano, some guy is just like playing on some bells.
I wish we had like more on whoever's doing that, because he seems like a really kind of a real hero, forgotten hero of Edinburgh. Whoever's
Yeah.
just like bashing these massive tunes out. Maybe.
If we had a higher budget, I think we would now intersperse a bit of tubular bells to try and really bring the message home. But unfortunately, I mean, we could hum it, but then I think we might still need to pay for the rights. So yeah, imagine tubular bells at this point, audience.
Yeah. Feel free to pause this podcast and take a couple of minutes to just imagine them in your head, or play them from a source that we cannot, and then you can come back to it. We'll still be here.
Great.
There are a few historical examples of playing music on the bells, but I think we might come back to that in the discussion and talk a bit more about how the bells were involved in everyday life. These bells were worn out in 1890, and they were all sold off, although we got one back in 1955. Someone donated it, and you can find it in the entrance to the chambers aisle. So we have managed to keep hold of a few of our bells.
Did they get sold to St Mary's Cathedral? Are these those bells?
Some of them did. So I think 4 of them got sold off to St Mary's, and then a lot of them went to private homes.
Okay.
And there's a few more around Edinburgh, but I don't know where they all are.
Yeah. It's funny because I remember reading that they'd been sold to St Mary's, and then St Mary's didn't like them or something, and then they just never hung them. So yeah, bad bells.
No accounting for taste, I guess.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting little bit that slightly confuses the timeline, but I want to put it in because it seems legit. So I talked earlier about this Scotsman article from 1980, and in it he talks about an elderly citizen writing into his local paper in the 1960s that he remembers popular melodies playing from St Giles steeple in his youth, so possibly kind of late 1800s. So I did a little look into it because it seemed surprising that they would still be playing this late. And there is a history of the cathedral by our old friend William Chambers, unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
And he is talking about his time in Edinburgh. And in the latter half of the 1800s, at least, there is a set of musical bells dating from 1698. And they were fitted in the open part of the spire. And this is my favourite bit. They were played daily by a lady of advanced age. That's a William Chambers direct quote. And I'm thinking, who's letting a woman of advanced age go up? It's so dangerous to get up there. She's going into the spire.
Yeah.
So again, another forgotten hero.
Yeah, commitment to bells, yeah.
We'll move along a bit now. The 2 quarter bells we have today, one dates from 1706 or possibly 1700, depending on what source you read. One dates from 1728. And the Great Bell, which you remember from 1460, in 1774 was found to be broken. And at the time, it was known as the Tinkling Tom. And at the moment, Stephen, this was your idea, so if you want to tell people what it's called at the moment.
Well, yeah, we about 3 years ago, I think we named it Big Tam because one of our Beadles, who are the church officers, he had been in with St Giles, I think, for 10 years at that point, and he was called Tom, so we named it Big Tam. So there's an interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
But
it's just, I thought that's a really good bit of historical continuity there without even realising it.
conspiracy theory for our listeners here. I have, since we named the bell Big Tam, I have found 3 or 4 other churches that have bells either named Big Tom, so Tam being the Scots for Tom, or something related to Tom. I just think maybe people like Tom bells.
Maybe that's it. I mean, it feels right. Like, it feels
Yeah.
like a good name for a bell. I don't know if I would call a bell Ciara or Stephen. Honestly,
No, I
it doesn't
wouldn't.
have the same ring to it.
No, God. Can you edit
No
that
one
out?
thought that, but I did little pointy gun fingers at Stephen there, but no one could see. So hang on, sorry, I've totally lost my place thinking about Big Tam. Right, back on it. So basically, that takes us up to the bells we have today. So we have the Great Bell from 1460, and we have the 2 smaller bells which ring on the quarter hour from the kind of early 1700s. So that's the timeline that I managed to construct for the bells. I think there's probably more to it, but that sort of seems like the simplest way of looking at their history.
Great, yeah. Well, I think we can certainly bring bits out in discussion. I think my clocks might be a little bit shorter, but I would say certainly more emotional, and there's going to be a bit of ups and downs and turmoil, I think. I mean, there's no elderly statesman climbing towers, but there's certainly there's intrigue.
I think we should get straight to it.
Yeah, okay. Our clocks, as you might have guessed from that intro, they've not had a smooth time of it. But the nice way of saying it is there's been a clock in the tower since at least 1588. That came from Lindores Abbey. It was repaired so it would be fit for the purposes of St Giles. By 1721, however, we get a new clock, which I was going to say I believe is in the council storage room. It is in the council storage room. I've seen it. And then in 1912, we get the clock that we have now. So that sounds like pretty plain sailing. However, each clock had its own tricky installation period, I suppose, is the better way of saying it. So the first clock, which you've mentioned some of the bells, and there was an old document that Ciara found, and for some reason it was 90 degrees the wrong way, and I decided not to turn it around so it was the right way. So I was reading it with my head on the side. And it was also written in Old Scots, and it took me about 3 paragraphs to realise that a word that looks like cock is actually meant to be clock. It's K-O-C-K, so there was a cocksmith at one point.
Yeah, that tripped me up a bit as well, I have to admit. It took me a while to get my head around that one. I was like, God, Old Edinburgh sounds like a nightmare.
Exactly. But so that was a bit tricky. But once I'd realised that, I was absolutely flying. And it looked as though they had one guy his job was just to ring the bell at the time that the church or the council would stipulate, yeah, we want it rung every half hour, so he would just go and do it. But by 1560, I think it was, they decided they needed a clock. So it took them like 20 years to decide that between, yes, we need a clock, and then, yes, let's buy a clock. They couldn't even make their own clock. They had to buy a broken one from Lindores Abbey and then have that one fixed and fitted. So it's not too bad, but it's not too plain sailing. The next one, though, Ciara, this is where the intrigue comes in. So I'd heard this story a few different times, and then Ciara sent me another bit of stuff to read, which really kind of fleshed out the story. But basically, this is real tricky. So by 1721, they decided a new clock's necessary. Almost 150 years of refurbished clock, and it's dead. So the council take the slightly risque move of going to London for a clock. And the Edinburgh clockmakers and Edinburgh hammermen, so they're the metalworking guild, they decide that this is absolutely not on. So anyway, the clock gets fitted, but the one thing that's clock mechanism gets fitted, sorry. The one thing that's very important between a clock mechanism and its faces are these very crucial iron rods that I'm doing a lot of hand symbols here for Ciara, so I'll try and do more voice symbols. But basically, the rod that goes up, and then it goes 90 degrees to some cogs, and 90 degrees, there are some faces, as you might imagine with a clock. Ciara is absolutely wetting herself at my attempts here, I think.
I really wish you could see it. It's so funny. Sorry,
This is very professional stuff. So essentially, anyway, there's about five rods that are knocking about, and these rods have made their way up, and they've made it to Edinburgh safe and sound. However, in one of the closes, in one of the back alleys, the hammermen and the clockmakers have hatched a plan, and they beat the guy up that's holding these rods, and they steal the rods and they take them and they hide them. And then so essentially they this is the bit I can never understand when I hear this story, because they ring the council and they're like, hey, well, they probably don't ring them. They contact the council and they say, we've got your rods, but we want a meeting. And the council go, yeah, sure, right then, okay, yeah. And they have this meeting about how it wasn't cool that they went to London and how they should have come to the Edinburgh guilds to have this clock and rods made. And so what happens apparently then, which is a bit that I didn't know, which came from your research, was that the hammermen have this like triumphant procession of the rods to the council, and they're like, okay, here are your rods, and nobody gets arrested. So like, not only have they stolen all these rods, but they kind of assaulted this guy. And like, because there's a bit where they say they look down and he's like knocked out, he's unconscious and like battered and bloody. And so anyway, so essentially the rods get fitted and everything's fine. And the council promised that next time they need a clock, they'll come to someone Edinburgh, come to someone local. So the 1721 clock gets its faces, everything's working fine. But by 1912, there's issues. I've heard a few different versions of this, so I suppose I'll go through the one I've heard, and then we can maybe add some caveats. But essentially, anyone who's seen St Giles now will know there are no clock faces on the outside of the cathedral. And supposedly what happened was that Ritchie's, who are a very Edinburgh clockmaking company, don't worry about that, no one's going anywhere except Edinburgh, still exists today, they said that they would repair their mechanism or fix it or give a new mechanism. But there was one condition on Ritchie's working with the city on this, and that was that they hated the clock faces, and so they wouldn't have their reputation damaged by these ugly clock faces. So the clock faces were removed, and then Ritchie's fitted the clock. Now, I mean, the article you sent kind of echoes my theory in that 270 years of clock faces, how had no one decided they were ugly before that? But anyway, I think that's maybe something we'll discuss in the discussion anyway. The article you sent me didn't really mention Ritchie's as saying they were ugly. I think it was decided as a communal thing. But the long and short of it is we get a clock mechanism in 1912 and the clock faces come down. So now the clock mechanism only drives the bells, the 3 bells. So the 2 quarter-hour bells and then the 1 hour bell. And then the final wrap up to this, which is very, very, I think we've both been dealing in older history, but now we come really to the present day and mechanization, well, not mechanization, electrification. Because over the last 5 years, Ritchie's have been electrifying all the different clocks in the area, all the large clocks of Edinburgh. So there's only one that's hand wound. And they put what's called an auto wind on the clock mechanism. So that means that it's wound, instead of a man coming and attaching a key and winding away, it's now done by electricity. So he no longer has to climb the tower twice a week and do a total of 1,200 winds. I had the pleasure or misfortune of having to wind the clock at one point, and it was not fun. I can't imagine having to do it every week. And then not just that clock, all the rest of them. And there's also what's really cool. So the clock, when it was fitted in 1912, gains about 6 seconds a day. Now, apparently that's really good for a huge clock. Apparently anything under 5 minutes, you're golden pretty much. But they've also put an auto-regulating magnet in, which catches the pendulum. So it's got, I assume, an atomic clock. And if that atomic clock recognizes that our clock is too far out, it catches the pendulum, holds it for a bit, and then lets it go again. So, yeah. So that's the clocks in St Giles, with maybe slightly over-egged drama, but, you know.
You say over-egged drama, but it really does seem like it was a huge sticking point at the time. And it does amaze me that no one got arrested for it. I don't know if maybe Edinburgh was just kind of, I like to imagine it as quite a lawless place at that time, or possibly that it was sort of like the council didn't really care that much either way, and their hammermen were just known for like being real drama queens, and they were always doing this kind of thing. And so they had their big procession, and the council's like looking out the window thinking, oh, okay, like here we go again. Yes, fine, you win.
Yeah. I just love the idea that, yeah, this is kind of a romantic story of Edinburgh merchants getting their own way, but somewhere in a hospital, hopefully being looked after, is this guy who's just kind of forgotten the victim of this whole thing.
I know, bless him. He was probably, every time he walked past the clock face, he was like, oh, for goodness sake, like, reminded of like the trauma that he went through well, I guess for a good reason, actually. Not in vain.
Yeah, indeed. So with discussion then, shall we start off? We've got there's a few, I think the audience may well have some ideas as to what we might discuss, but we may as well kick off. Do we want to do bells or clocks discussing first?
Well, should we start with bells? Should we keep the order that we've been doing it in? Is there anything that you kind of wanted to flag up a few things during my little timeline there?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that the bells had William Chambers said that the bells were not very good. Now, I don't actually, because given that there's a lot of different bells at Chambers' time, hard to know which bells he's referring to, I suppose. But James Naismith, who's a famous engineer, he really loves St Giles and really loves the bells. In his autobiography, he mentions them a couple of times, and he actually gives this really, really lovely description of his whole experience. He must have gone into the tower at some stage. So I'll read this because it's really quite nice. So he says, on my way up to the top flat being where our elderly statesman would have lived, I think, or certainly had some time there. That would have been her office. On my way up to the top flat where the chimes were played, I had to pass through the vault in which the great pendulum was slowly swinging in its ghostly like tick-tack, tick-tack, which if anyone has ever been up to the tower, it really is a kind of ding, ding, ding. And then he says, while the ancient great clock was keeping time with sudden and startling movement, the whole scene was almost as uncanny as the witch's cell underneath, which I think he says at some stage that there was a witch burned in the tower, which I've never heard of.
I've never heard that before. No way.
No. But then he gives a really nice, so I don't know if anyone knows what a carillon is. Maybe we should explain what a carillon is. So instead of having, the easiest way to describe this is the Mars bar advert, I think. Or sorry, the generic chocolate advert, where they've got all the guys swinging from the ropes and you've got a kind of 10 bell ringers. That's not what's happening here at all. A carillon is, well, I'll let this James Naismith describe it. So he says, the person playing, we saw the musician at work. He was seen in violent action, beating or hammering on the keys of a gigantic pianoforte-like apparatus. The instruments he used were two great leather-faced mallets, one of which he held in each hand. So essentially, he's got two mallets, and he's got a set of keys in front of him, and he's just hammering on these keys with these mallets, and that's what's playing the bells. So that's what a carillon is. There's a really nice one in Budapest, if anyone has been to Budapest or is going to Budapest. And then they're connected by iron rods to the chimes above. But the bit that I really wanted to emphasize was that Naismith then says, so he's gone for a walk around, I think, with his dad. And he says, I sat as a child beside lassies watching the clays, I'm not sure what the clays is, it must be a Scots word, on Calton Hill and hearing the chimes of St Giles. So I think the chimes of St Giles were a real part of Edinburgh and part of what's going on in Edinburgh, and people are comforted by them. So Chambers, I mean, for people that have been listening to Ciara and I's other episode on Chambers, he can stuff off.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good point, in that nowadays bells are kind of seen as quite a sort of old-fashioned romantic thing. We don't really think about them too much, but there have been times in Edinburgh's history where they've played a really crucial part in the history of Scotland and the history of what's going on at the time, and they really reflect the mood of the people. I think a good example is the bells were actually played in St Giles after the Battle of Flodden. So the Battle of Flodden was in 1513, and the Scottish king was killed at the battle. So the bells in St Giles were played to warn the townspeople, to warn the people of Edinburgh that the English were coming, that the English were invading. So they were used for not just for sort of religious reasons, but also for political reasons as well. So I think that's quite interesting. And then two perhaps more tongue-in-cheek examples, which I really like. So quite famously in 1707, which is when Scotland sort of formally joined the rest of Britain, the bells played famous Scottish song, Why Should I Be Sad on My Wedding Day? And I think I will let the title speak for itself there. But the other one, which is less well known, is that 7 years prior to that, there was the Darien disaster, which I won't go into too much detail over, but was one of sort of the main reasons for the 1707 Union. And essentially, a lot of Scottish people went to try and create a colony, and it could not have gone worse. And the king at the time was not particularly interested in doing anything to help these people who were sort of dying in huge numbers. And so the bells played Wilful Willie, wilt thou be wilful still, which is a bit of a tongue twister.
I think it's worth noting that the king was actually actively trying to make sure the Scots colony failed. So possibly that's an even more of a bit of a dig in.
Yeah, exactly. So I really liked that. I thought it was interesting that they, it's not just kind of popular fun tunes that were being played. It was actually almost a form of protest in of itself.
Yeah. And it's interesting that we're talking about the different uses, because over the past year, and for some reason, I've been at St Giles about 5 years now. Up until this year, no requests. This year, we've had about four or five requests for the bells being played. Someone will say, "Oh, can you play the bells for this reason?" We say, "No, it's just time bells. We can't play them." All right, okay, thanks anyway. And then someone else will come along. "Oh, can you play them for this reason?" "No, just time bells." So even today, it is something that I think people are still looking at. Can the bells be rung for special reasons and special occasions to mark things? None quite so provocative as those two, but certainly still being asked for.
Yeah, well, they were ringing them, I think, because there's a reference. They were ringing them for political reasons for quite a while, because somewhere there's a reference saying that there was a particular battle in the Boer War which was quite kind of important, and that had a lot of Scottish battalions fighting in it. And there is a little note in the archive saying the bells didn't ring for that because they were in poor condition, which suggests that they would usually be rung for victories or for defeats, even in conflicts that are not happening in Scotland. So it's clearly quite a considerable tradition.
Yeah. And the thing I wanted to mention, because I think this certainly will be something that people are aware of, is the ringing of bells. So there was a really famous article about, what was it, about 5 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, about a church down south where they were having their tower redone, so the bells had been taken out. And then there was a guy that had moved in during that period, and I think he'd been warned that the bells rung, but he had ignored it or whatever. And then when the bells started ringing again, he took a case out against them to say that his life was being materially affected and the bells should have to stop ringing. Now, the hope is that, I can't remember the outcome of the case. The hope would be obviously that the bells could carry on ringing, but actually we had the opposite. When the auto wind was being fitted, the bells were out of action for about 6 weeks. And we had someone complain that they weren't ringing because they were so used to the time being rung by the bells that they'd kind of got used to it. And I think that's an interesting question as to, one, what function do the bells have now, and is it a useful function, or are they just being rung just because they've always been rung?
That's a good question, isn't it? Because I'm not sure it has a simple answer, because I think people's relationships to not only the bells but kind of the church itself is quite varied. Some people think maybe we should keep it going for historical reasons. Some people think that it's part of the fabric of worship. I think that's a tricky question.
I think I like to hear them, in that I like to, first of all, they're nice notes, so that's always nice. But then I always think, when I realize that I'm hearing them when I'm not at work, I always think, oh, I wonder what the time is. And then, there is still that time. And the fact that it is so accurate now, I think, is quite useful, because the Tron for Yonks was horribly inaccurate. And now it should be more regulated, because it's now got the auto wind as well, and the auto regulator. So yeah. Well, how about we segue from bells into clocks with this idea? We both mentioned the idea of the bells or the clock being made locally or not. And the council very noticeably went to a local guy for the bells. I think his name was John Michael, was it Michael? For some of the bells. And he supposedly had never cast bells before. He was a hammerman, so he was used to working with metal, but he'd never cast bells. So he had to have some tuition on casting bells. But apparently once he'd cast these bells, they didn't last as long as bells should last. So what I'm proposing is that when the council were thinking about where they go for their production of things, maybe they were a bit once burnt, twice shy. So they said, no, you know what? Well, last time we did something with St Giles, we went local. It didn't go well. Let's go to London. Let's get this sorted out properly, see what happens.
It's hard though, isn't it? Because the context of kind of Scottish-London relations at the time is part of it as well. I don't think that Scotland and England were getting on particularly well in 1721. Is that...
Yeah.
You might know this because you also did economic history, but the South Sea bubble was happening around that time. I think a lot of which is this big economic crash in London. And a lot of the kind of anger against it was directed at Scots. They were seen as sort of hoarding English gold and that sort of thing. So relationships were not great.
Yeah. And I think, well, this kind of brought me on to a little bit of another point, in that there's, especially in the current climate, I think it's also about saying what is local, because whilst London might not have been considered local then, for clocks and bells, now London is considered very local, I suppose, and now it would be Swiss clocks and bells that would be the unlocal thing. We have to kidnap the Swiss clockmakers, but I think maybe now we're a bit better at not kidnapping people if we don't like their things. But yeah, I just kind of like the idea of local work for local people. That kind of, that always that tricky argument as to whether you should buy local or not. I suppose very seldom is it used for bells.
But as a good thing to think about, especially in terms of the rest of St Giles, like the Thistle Chapel, for instance. We really make a point of saying that it used Scottish craftsmen and used Scottish material, and that's something that people really seem to latch onto. So it can be quite an emotive discussion, I think. So.
Yeah, certainly so. And I think, maybe in Scotland it has been more so a discussion, just because of the dint of defining yourself relative to a neighbour, maybe. The one thing I did want to bring up about the clocks was the clock faces being ugly or not. Now, on the surface, that sounds a very, I suppose, fatuous argument. Oh, they're ugly, no. But I was more interested in the usage of them. I quite like the idea of time and how it's used in public life and what that means for us. One of the things I was going to throw out maybe is that the clock faces weren't so much moved because they were ugly, although maybe it was just thought, oh, well, we don't need them anyway. Because at the point in which they were discussing the clock faces, you had the Tron and the Hub that have been built quite recently, and the Balmoral all have huge clock faces on them. So maybe it was more of a case of, well, do we need them? No. Would it make St Giles prettier if they weren't there? Probably. Okay, let's get rid of them.
Well, I think that if you look at the old pictures of the clock faces, and we can try and upload some so people can have a look at them, they don't look great. Like, I know that maybe that's quite a superficial argument, but they really look like someone's like hammered a nail in and then just sort of hung it like you would a picture.
Yeah.
And they're not particularly historically accurate if you want to maintain kind of the tower as it was. So I'm very much in agreement that we don't need them, especially in like this day and age, when I can't imagine there are that many people in Edinburgh who are relying on any clock faces as their only form of time. I mean, I could be wrong, but so I think I'm pretty much behind the idea. I can understand why people do that. I will just say quickly, in terms of good anecdotes about clock faces, I'm sure you know this one as well. So the Balmoral clock, the Balmoral is just above Waverley train station. So it's very visible if you're coming to the train station from pretty much most angles, especially through the Old Town. And their clock is very slightly early. So to make sure that people have time for their train. And apparently they put it on time, and got all of these complaints from people saying, like, oh, I missed my train because I'm used to using the Balmoral clock face. I don't know if it's a bit of an urban legend, but I do like the story.
I really like that story, but I like to be very early for trains, just to be sure. And I love the idea that all these people who are cutting it so fine that 3 minutes was, the Balmoral. And also, how close are you to the Balmoral? Like, are you sat in a cafe looking at the Balmoral thinking, okay, still got time. Okay, run.
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
I don't buy it. I do buy it. The clock is 3 minutes fast for that reason, but in the modern era, I don't buy it.
Yeah, come on, man. And also, like, I'm with you. I cannot stand being even potentially late for anything. And the idea of only giving myself 3 minutes is just, I think, they deserve what they get. If you're using the Balmoral, and that's your own problem.
Oh, what I should mention, I really meant to mention this. What has happened to the clock faces, Ciara? I know you're dying to know the answer.
What has happened to the clock faces, Stephen? I'm dying to know the answer.
Yeah. So at varying points, there were 3 or 4 clock faces. And I think the South didn't have a clock face. And I wonder if that's because they had another clock face somewhere that it was deemed not necessary to have a clock face for the South of the city because they already had one. I don't know. Or maybe it was the South. No one really cared about them, so people would fund north, east, and west, but not south. But anyway, what has happened to the clock faces? The clock faces, most of them were taken away, and one was found in a garden. I can't remember whose garden it was, but it was Lady Someone's garden. But the clock hands is really interesting because I was reading an account of a guy that had visited the tower. I think maybe 3 years ago, and he described where he'd seen one of the clappers for the bells, the musical bells, and one of the clock hands. So I decided to go up, and he had described it in 1997, and I was back. I was there in what 2012, let's say. Sorry, not 2012. I would have been there in 2016, and I found the clapper and the hand where he had described them being. So for a while we had the clapper and then the minute hand, and then only 6 months ago, someone said, "Oh, Stephen, you might like this. I think it's one of the hands from the clock faces," and they just had it in a cupboard. So
Oh my God.
yeah, there are two hands up in the tower now, which we show people on the tours. But that's where two of the hands have gone to. As to whether the other four or maybe six hands have gone to, I don't know.
Some of the bells, I can't remember which ones, are in the Museum of Edinburgh down the road from us. So I wonder if they have anything else, possibly even in storage. That feels like the kind of place that might do, but the trail runs pretty cold on all of this sort of thing.
It was quite funny because I think you went to the Museum of Edinburgh's storage thing as well, did you?
No, I didn't.
Or did you know? Oh, it must have just been Jess. But I went and they've got our old clock there. It used to be on display. And then they had a load of bits, and they said, "We don't know where these bits go." And I spent about 10 minutes just putting these bits back together for them and then putting them on the clock. So now the clock is all back together again as it should be. And the bells, yeah, they just have those bells knocking about around there as well. I'd hope if the cathedral ever becomes a bit more secure, we can maybe do a bit of an exhibit of it all. But I don't think they'd let us have the clock just because it's absolutely huge and must weigh several tons.
At least now you have this podcast, so at least now everyone knows that it was you who reassembled the
Exactly. Yeah. Unless someone else has gone and disassembled it again, which would be wanton vandalism.
Yeah, shocking. Yeah. Let's just hope that hasn't happened.
Yeah, good. So you and Jess mentioned the meat cage at one point, and I actually had heard of this. And there are photos of the tower, and then in the crown you can see the kind of the outline of the meat cage because it was actually exterior. So there was a carillon inside the tower and a carillon in the crown spire itself, and it was called the meat cage essentially because it looked like what you would hang carcasses off an abattoir. Yeah, pretty disgusting. And you kind of, I'll try and find one of the photos that's out of copyright that we can put on the website and then we'll try and maybe circle the meat cage. But you get a bit of a feeling for what the meat cage is. That's why it's called the meat cage.
So I reckon Meat Cage is as good a place as any to end this podcast. So as usual, thank you for listening. And just to say that St Giles has been brilliant about keeping all of its staff on, and it allows us to work on side projects such as this one. However, if you would like to donate to St Giles, we'd be very grateful, and there is a link down below that will help you to do that. So have a lovely rest of your day, and we will see you next time.